So you hear that it's heard, and you can see that I'm an art historian and I'm a Renaissance art historian. And the Wunderkammer, this is a German word, but the Wunderkammer is actually a concept of Renaissance Italy. And so I'm going to take you back to the origins of this term and this concept. And then when you go up to the gallery, you get a chance to see collections from the last almost 200 years exhibited according to a 21st century gallery director's perspective of how to assemble a Wunderkammer. So I'm going to give you sort of the origins of it and the basic ideas behind it. Now, it is a German word, but the Italians use this German word because they don't have a good Italian word to that parallels this. And so I will explain to you why we use the word, but let me talk first about collecting stuff, because it seems to be an innate human impulse to collect stuff. And it goes back as far as we can trace in human history. I show you guys here a slide from prehistoric Europe of a burial of a man in which he's been placed in the tomb with stuff that surely cannot practically help him in the afterlife, but somehow reflects his status, position, power, authority, maybe some magic old powers that he had in life. And this seems to be a lot of what collecting is about. We think today about collecting being about, well, it just makes us happy, or there are aesthetic decisions. But really, the impulse is so long-lived in human beings and so closely tied to power and authority that it seems to be more than simply accumulating stuff. The ancients, that is the people of ancient Greece and Rome, but even in the ancient Near East and Babylon, also collected objects, deliberately and self-consciously set up collections of objects, put them on display, and this continues right through human history, through the Middle Ages. But mostly these things that are collected, I forgot an important point, are valuable in and of themselves. Much like this man buried with all this gold. Ancient Greeks, ancient Romans collected precious objects, precious stones, rare materials, and particularly they were very, very prone to collecting human-made objects, works of art, but also interesting kinds of devices and things that human beings made. What we don't get is a collection in the ancient world of natural objects. It takes the Middle Ages to lead us to a collection of natural objects, and I'm sorry that I was showing you here a hand, which I think we can safely say is a natural object, and which is today still on display in the Cathedral of San Marco in Venice. The collection of precious objects continues right through the Middle Ages. But on top of that become natural objects, sometimes body parts, sometimes stones, shells, precious materials, seemingly random materials, not necessarily precious materials, that people of the Middle Ages, the Christians of the Middle Ages, believed to channel power. And that's spiritual power. That somehow opened a connection between the earthly world and the world beyond. So although natural objects get collected in the Middle Ages, they're still not collected in and of themselves. We have to come into the Renaissance, into the 15th century in Italy, before we find people beginning to collect objects of the natural world for interest in the natural world. Not because these objects suggest wealth, power, authority, not because these objects channel some divine or magical power, but because these objects are inherently interesting. And the place where this ends up being displayed is in the Wunderkammer. Now the word Wunderkammer comes from, for any of you who speak German, Germans have a wonderful way of just plunging two words together. So the first word is Wunder, which means wonder, and the second is Kammer, means room or chamber. Right? So this is the wonder chamber. Now, in English, it is very, very typically called Wunderkammer because that word Wunderkammer is so upsetting for English speakers. It's often called a cabinet of curiosities. And I think this is completely misleading and takes away from what a Wunderkammer really was and what it meant to the people who created them. So let me talk to you guys a little bit about Wunderkammer. And the key issue for me is the word Wunder, which in English means wonder. But the problem with the English word wonder is that it has two meanings to it. One is, gosh, I wonder if it's going to rain tonight. You know, you're just thinking. And then the other meaning, and the German word does not mean that. It does not have that meaning. To ponder, to think, to puzzle, to consider. The word in German, Wunder, means wonder in the sense of wonderful. In the sense that a wonder is something that is extraordinary, incredible, remarkable, marvelous, astonishing. It is something, in other words, that causes a viewer, if you're seeing something, or a hearer, if you're hearing something, or the mind and spirit in general, if you're experiencing something, to feel awe, astonishment, amazement, a kind of stunned quality. And that, I think, is very, very important. So we have to think about the Wunderkammer, the first collections in the Renaissance of natural objects, which were collected also with those old man-made objects, paintings, sculptures, precious objects, jewelry, vessels made of gold and silver and precious stones, that these are all objects that astonished the collector, that amazed the collector, that made the collector feel a sense of wonder. Right? Wonder is both an intellectual and an emotional thing. And so I don't want you to lose sight of that emotional aspect of wonder in the Wunderkammer. So let's not call it a cabinet of curiosities, right? Because that makes it feel very mundane. How curious it is that there's a shell right here. It's quite different from saying, oh, look at the miracle of this shell. So let's try to keep that, at least as we think of the origins of the Wunderkammer, in our minds. The first Wunderkammers, in fact, were not even Wunderkammers. The term was not, the concept of these collections that created wonder occurred before the term was coined, and it was coined by a German, so that's why it's a German term. And then the Italians are all like, oh yeah, we got to use that term too. We don't have a word like wonder. And to give you the first sort of collections of things, I show you a painting from the Italian Renaissance of a scholar in his study. Now this is a religious painting because Renaissance paintings almost always are. And it is a representation of St. Augustine, the great medieval theological scholar. In his study, he's actually in the process of working on one of his many, many, many explorations of biblical teachings in this image. And what we see here is what the Renaissance would have considered a scholar's study. The characteristics of an educated person, or the belongings of an educated person gathered around him to enable him to have these profound thoughts and this deep intellectual and spiritual engagement with the Bible. Now, this is not the very first time that studies had been represented. Indeed, throughout the Middle Ages, we have a number of representations of scholars in their study. I don't have one of St. Augustine from the Middle Ages. This is St. Jerome, but it's a similar kind of idea. Here is the scholar seated with an open book, and there are his books gathered around him. I hope you can see that Augustine's study is a lot more interesting. Because in the Renaissance, to be an educated person is very different from the Middle Ages conception of reading books. An educated person, a theologian in the Middle Ages, reads books, reads texts. In the Renaissance, an educated man absolutely has books all around him. But you see he has an armillary sphere up there. He has, this is music. This is sheet music here, a book of music here, and a sheet of music there. He has, in the background, I want to show you a different one. In the background, he has more books, and these are, up above, are instruments of navigation and also of astronomical observation. And he has works of art. So here are some sculptures. These things that actually look a little bit like, I don't know, prehistoric flints are actually medallions, collected from the ancient world, metals or large coins, and even more books. A scholar has many ways in the Renaissance of learning about the world and becoming an educated man. He needs to know, yes, book learning, absolutely. He needs to know music. He needs to know the physical world, astronomy, navigation, scientific and measuring tools. He needs to know art. He needs to know even nature. Because here on his desk, there's a shell. So for the Renaissance, it's not enough to read. You must absolutely observe the world around you and think about that. To be an educated man, to be a theologian, to explain God. Now, that is the educated part of this, but what about the wonder part? If you look at this close-up of Augustine's face, he could be having writer's block right now, I admit it. But I actually think what the artist is trying to do here is to suggest that he's been struck by some wonderful idea. And that's sort of hard to do in representing the Renaissance, because Renaissance art not only wants to show you that educated people understand the world around them, but Renaissance artists and audiences want to see art that recreates reality. So how do you suggest wonder when a guy's sitting in his study with his stuff around him? It's really, really hard to do. I mean, you have this look, but this sort of pregnant look, but it's a little bit, let's be honest, ambiguous. So we add a little element here. I don't. In Renaissance thought, and this is actually goes back to the ancients, but the Renaissance, the thinkers of the Renaissance mention this too. Dogs have a special power to perceive the wondrous, to perceive things that are outside of ordinary human experience. And in this painting, do you see how prominent the dog is? It's not some dog tucked in the corner, oh, Augustine loves dogs, let's have his pet there warming his feet. This is a dog who looks up in a very meaningful way, in the same direction Augustine looks up in a meaningful way. And what we have here, in this scholar's study, in his collection of stuff, is a moment of wonder, which might come from the shell, or the books, or the music, or the measuring devices. The artist doesn't tell us that. But at least is this moment of emotional sort of, right? Sort of gasping awe, without, Augustine looking like a fool like I just did. So this is the basis, this idea that educated people study the world and study the nature to get at something beyond the ordinary. This is the basis of the Wunderkammer. Now I'm really going to show you a real Wunderkammer, one that's actually named and identified as such. We don't, as it happens, know whose Wunderkammer this is. The name of the owner of this chamber filled with interesting and wondrous objects has been lost, but we do know that he was visited by the Archdukes Isabella and Albert, who were the rulers of the Spanish Netherlands. So clearly the visitors are a little bit more important in this painting than the owner is. And we have the Archduke Albert and the Archduchess Isabella right there. And if you look at this painting, you can see it even more clearly than we saw in the scholar's study. The objects that fill, presumably the owner, but also the visitors, with wonder. So there are works of art, and works of art always for the Renaissance have this ability to take you emotionally as well as intellectually out of the ordinary. All these paintings back there. There are sculptures on this table, sculptures up there, musical instruments. Very much the same elements of the educated man in the scholar's study. And then at these tables, here on the left and on the right, some of the natural elements, the elements of the natural world and of measurement and navigation. Although I have to say, in all honesty, this one here, from this table on the left, that's an invention, a human invention that's meant to be a clock, a perpetual clock, which I believe did not work. But still, and these two men right here who are looking at a painting, here we have this colossal vase of flowers, very carefully studied. You guys recognize the sunflower right at the top there? That is not a European flower. That only arrives in Europe in the middle of the 16th century. And sticking it in here is a reference to how Europeans thought, oh my gosh, those flowers, those monster flowers that came from South America, how wondrous God's creation is. So this spectacular, and let's be honest, incredible flower arrangement here is designed to help you feel the wonder that they're feeling seeing the real thing. Over here on the right, maps, navigational aids, shells again, they always really like shells, and various kinds of little clocks and devices there. And people talk about them, and they're conversing about it. Now here, I have to say, I feel a little sad that we're not feeling the wonder too strongly. There are this is our collection owner right there. There's the Duke and the Duchess who seem to be, if anything, sort of bored with this required visit. But guess what? They're still dogs. And while wonder is perhaps too strong, the dogs are at least interested and are not as bored as the people are. And so we again get from the Renaissance perspective this sense that something interesting and something out of the ordinary, the dogs aren't going nuts, that would be bad indicate dogs, but that there is something interesting going on sort of on the interior of these people as they experience these natural objects and these human-made wonders. If you look at this detail at the center of the image, you can see that there's actually yet another little painting propped over on the floor over beside them. And it's one that particularly draws our attention, so I wanted to show it to you guys. Here are people who don't understand wonders, who destroy paintings, smash musical instruments, tear up books, and break open objects. I want you to notice that one has a cat head and one has a donkey's head. See, cats and donkeys are dogs. They don't experience wonder. Like human beings, educated human beings of the Renaissance. So we have a worldview here that is very specific to thinking about what Renaissance people ought to care about. This is an instructive image. Look what matters. Look what important people look at. Feel that wonder. Don't be ignorant, barbarous, and destroy things. And it's all couched in the language of Renaissance painting, which is about itself recreating reality. So reality and artfulness are not only represented in this image, they are represented by this image because it's a painting of the real world. It's reality and artfulness. This desire to engage the viewer really characterizes Wunderkammer paintings. And there are a lot of them that don't really concentrate too much on the people who come into them or the owners of the collections, but simply display the collections so that you, the viewer, can have the same wonder that presumably the collector and the people who see these in the flesh do. And again, we have these combinations of objects here on the left on a table, shoved up against a wall with lots of little paintings on the wall, and then again shells. It's almost always shells in these Wunderkammer collections. Are there any shells on the shelf upstairs? Two shells, like Augustine studied, and also some rocks, and these are coins. So the educated person as nature and human artfulness and history and the physical world and the physical past at his or her fingertips. And by the way, it would be his or her. It's not just men doing this. And here, over here, we literally have a cabinet, because this is what they start to do, is build cabinets for these collections. And you can see again this kind of jumble of things, not arranged in any way that suggests logical connections or relationships between things or causation. This is all about assembling things so your eye doesn't know where to rest and you're going, oh, look at that. It's meant to stun you with the wonder of coral and bugs. Sorry. Sorry, I'm not a bug fan. And little paintings and medium-sized paintings and ancient reliefs and so forth. So art and nature for the Renaissance are not the same, but there may be two sides of a coin. They partake of the same experience. They reveal the same kind of sense of the world, that human beings do things and nature does things, and they are meant to evoke similar kinds of emotions in people. That's the wonder of it. As European exploration expands and gets ever more intense, Wunderkammers often will be solely devoted to certain kinds of collections. For example, this is a collection of varied objects, plant, animal, mineral, and human-made, from the Americas. By the way, many of them not actually ever found in the Americas, because accuracy doesn't matter. And so we have these kinds of objects laid out for us to wonder at. If we can't see these objects for ourselves, we can look into this world and partake of some of the astonishment and awe that it creates. But inevitably, I suppose, as the Renaissance wanes, collections start to specialize. This is the gallery, and I really should say art gallery, of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, who was one of those small German princelings, of which there were so many. And he had this massive house, and he started dividing up his collections by category. So this is the art collection. He also had like a shell collection, and then he had a, I don't know, rock collection. So he started to categorize things. And as we start to categorize things, we're moving towards, and I know there are scientists in this room, and I hesitate to say this, but we're moving towards a stronger scientific approach. The idea of categories, of taxonomies, of an objective perspective in which we're not saying, how does this make us feel, but how do we understand certain types of objects, how do they relate to each other, what do they reveal about nature's workings. There begins to be this breakdown of the emotion, and indeed you read in scientists and philosophers, philosophers and natural philosophers, at the end of the Renaissance saying that wonder is to be avoided because it causes you to be too emotional and to get too worked up about things so that you can't think about them clearly. I'm only showing you the painting one because that's all there's a painting of. Painters don't really love making paintings of rooms full of shells. But I do want to point out to you, since dogs are so important in my particular worldview, that the dogs just don't care anymore. Right? The dogs are here with sticks and they're doing doggy things, and it's like there's no wonder, there's no aha moment in dog face or human face. There's just this blankness. The emotion seems to pull away from it a little bit. And then the same in many ways is true when you get to these collections of natural objects. So this is an engraving rather than a painting, which comes out of a book, of an inventory and description of an Italian nobleman's collection of curiosities. And you can see that he scatters things all over. And I think the people, it's hard to tell whether this person's behaving like an art historian with that pointer have dogs, but really, no amazement, no wonder. We're thinking more and more about how does this fit in the world? How does the world work? Rather than how do I feel? And isn't it extraordinary that nature or God makes things this way? Until we ultimately get to very, okay, I'm going to talk like an art historian here, right? Very sort of boring rows of shelves with specimens on them. I'm sorry, there's a biologist here. You probably get very excited about specimens. But these are like glass jars with specimens in them. Visually, I'm just saying visually, it's not exciting. The mishmash, the excitement of looking here at a shell and there at a clock and there at an astrolabe or an astronomical map and there at a painting. Here it is, Rachel. Yes, I'll study. Yes, I will examine. But I'm not. But I'm rational and I'm reasoned and I'm calm and I'm thinking. I'm not engaged and excited and emotional. And so we get, at this point, I would say, the cabinet of curiosities. This is where the arrangement of objects begins to suggest a kind of scientific bed. This, over here on the right, is a museum in Paris, which actually has what they call cabinets of curiosities. So, birds there, more shells, more shells over here, other plant life, and, lizards. Okay, sorry. And this is a painting of a shell cabinet. It's not, of course, arranged the way a scientist today would arrange it, I imagine. It's arranged rather aesthetically, according to shape and attractive shelving. But still, this is the beginnings of classifications which are essential to scientific investigation and understanding. For me, as an art historian, it's a shame that the wonder is gone. I guess I am an art historian and not a scientist because I want to feel those aha moments and sort of feel lifted out of myself. It's possible that the Wunderkammer upstairs could still paint you. Any of you who are art students or art history students are maybe already prepared to go in and look at natural objects and let yourself feel aha. It's rather interestingly explained up there. And I'd like to invite you to share canine wonder as you look at the exhibition in the gallery upstairs. Let it come back. Thank you.